Good day, ladies and gentlemen. To this point, we haven't focused as much as we might have done on the fact that the European continent was divided not just between East and West, but almost as importantly, between North and South. Since the Second World War, Spain, Portugal, and Greece seem to have been following a completely different route. Uninfluenced by the forces that were affecting the rest of the European continent and to a considerable degree marginalized from it. In those countries, neither communism, capitalism, nor social democratic consensus appeared to be having much, or in some cases any, impact. Their economies were among the most undeveloped in Europe, their political systems autocratic, if not frankly dictatorial, and their societies deeply divided. By the early 1970s, all of them were approaching crisis, with the regimes that had tried so hard to fend off the forces of modernity breaking down under the strain. The remarkable thing, though, is that all three managed against the odds to do away with these unrepresentative governments and install constitutional parliamentary ones, largely avoiding conflict in the process and, in a very short period of time, obtaining membership of the European Economic Community, the EEC. The democratization of Southern Europe is one of the least known, but also one of the most striking success stories of the past half century anywhere in the world. As you know from a previous talk, Spain was tremendously internally divided, ethnically and in other ways, but that was almost the least of her problems. In 1939, we discussed this a little bit, she emerged from a hideously bloody and bitter civil war that had divided not just Spain itself, but the whole of Europe. Nearly 2/3 of 1 million Spaniards had been killed, which in proportion to population, indeed in absolute numbers, is a hell of a lot. Beyond the sheer number of those who died was the manner in which they'd lost their lives. A great many atrocities had been committed, and memories of them were extremely fresh in the decades that followed. The Spanish economy, never very good at the best of times, had been wrecked. Lastly, the Second World War was about to begin, which was not the ideal time for inaugurating a national reconstruction effort and healing wounds. When the World War did start, most Europeans assumed, in conformity with their belief, a mistaken one, that the Civil War had been a kind of curtain raiser for the larger conflict between fascism and its opponents. So most people thought that Spain would automatically be on the side of the Axis powers. Inasmuch as the new dictator in Madrid, Francisco Franco, because he owed his victory very largely to the help provided him by Hitler and Mussolini, that wasn't an unreasonable assumption to make. But the proof that this interpretation of the Spanish Civil War was mistaken was what happened afterwards. For Franco, appearances and opinions to the contrary was not, in fact, a fascist. His had been a counter-revolution, an old-style dictatorship, intended to prevent change from occurring in Spain, not to promote it. the aspects of fascism that involved a state-led drive toward ultra-modernity, that left him completely cold. Now, under Franco, Spain was indeed a one-party state, though in contrast to the version that prevailed in the Soviet Union, that one party, the National Phalange, existed to serve the state rather than dictate to it. Its ideological content was so paper-thin that it's really not worth taken seriously or spending any time on. Phalangism was simply whatever the government needed it to be at any given time. Beyond that, Franco turned out to be a considerably more astute and cautious foreign policymaker than his reckless neighbor Benito Mussolini. The idea for Franco that he should support the Axis in the World War simply out of gratitude for their help in years past, that was something that cut no ice with him. Now, to be sure, Hitler was too powerful a neighbor just to dismiss out of hand, and after the fall of France in 1940, Franco did indicate that he might be willing to join the Axis in the war if the conditions and the price were right. But fundamentally, he had no genuine interest in doing so. And when he and Hitler met for the first and only time in October 1940, Franco made such vague commitments, raised so many objections to making good on them, and advanced so many impossible preconditions that Hitler said to his acolytes that he would prefer to have several teeth drilled than negotiate with Franco again. That in turn suited Francisco Franco down to the ground. As the war progressed, moreover, he was flexible enough to shift his government almost imperceptibly from a strongly pro-Axis to a mildly pro-Allied stance as soon as it became clearer who was going to win the war. Even so, Spain emerged in 1945 with a definite image problem. Nobody, and especially not the USSR, had forgotten that it had been Hitler and Mussolini that had set Franco up in power. The Soviet Union definitely wasn't forgetting that Spanish volunteers, the so-called Blue Legion, had fought on the Eastern Front with the Nazis against the Soviets. In 1946, the newly formed UN, the United Nations, as one of its very first acts, passed a resolution characterizing the Franco regime as illegitimate and effectively branding Spain a pariah state and demanding regime change in Madrid. The new Fourth Republic in France closed the Franco-Spanish border, basically blockaded the place between 1946 and 48. The hope was that by a combination of political and economic isolation, Franco could be driven from power, though nobody seemed completely sure as to precisely how that was going to be accomplished. What caused the ostracism, the cold shouldering of Spain to end was the Cold War, predictably enough. As the Soviet Union seemed to be heading on an expansionist course, former hate figures like Franco seemed less and less important. It was recalled that, after all, he had refrained from joining in the attack on the Allies when he might have done back in 1940, although, to be sure, he hadn't done a tremendous amount to help them. On top of that, Spain occupied a highly strategic position, very significant part of the world, standing athwart the only sea lane, the route between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. In 1953, the United States ended Spain's isolation by offering aid, economic assistance, in exchange for air and naval bases, or facilities at any rate. Spain was admitted to the UN in 1955, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, in 1960. But there were definite limitations to this policy of openness. It wasn't all a matter of forgive and forget. Franco's 2 applications to join the EEC in 1962 and again in 1964 were contemptuously rejected by the existing member countries. One of the more paradoxically hopeful aspects of Franco's rule, though, was the fact that it was so personal. It was so much him and nothing else. Because he knew better than to create a mass political movement that might one day be used against him, there would be little to keep his regime in being once he passed from the scene. His dictatorship was underpinned by support from powerful institutions in the country, especially, obviously, the army, of which he'd been a general, and also the Catholic Church. By the 1960s, those organizations, too, were having some second thoughts and resisting aspects of his rule. In a sense, Franco himself seems to have foreseen that something like that was going to occur. Although when taking power he had declared himself head of state and regent, that is to say, someone who rules on behalf of and in place of the king, he had never abolished the monarchy, and in fact had paid some attention to the education and training of the young crown prince, Juan Carlos, who he named in 1969 as his successor as head of state. Franco appears to have hoped that authoritarian rule would continue in Spain after his death, with a dictatorial government run by his heir apparent, Admiral Blanco. Blanco would run the country, and Juan Carlos, as head of state, would provide legitimacy to the system. But there was little chance of that happening, obviously, after ETA had blown Blanco to kingdom come. But even if that hadn't happened, Spain was changing dramatically in the 1960s, especially as it became one of Europe's, perhaps not just one of Europe's, in fact, Europe's leading tourist destination, and the economy began to boom. For about a 10-year period, until the oil crisis derailed things in '73, Spain had the highest growth rate in all of Europe, admittedly from a fairly low starting position. Underground political parties were now operating, and the Catholic Church was expressing support for a multi-party system. When Franco finally died in 1975, it was already clear that very little of his government would outlive him. But neither was it obvious what ought to replace it. Juan Carlos, the king, was considered something of a lightweight, not the sharpest tool in the box. The fact that as an 18-year-old he had accidentally shot dead his brother Alfonso lent a bit of credence to that supposition. And beyond him, most other potential political leaders were completely unknown to the Spanish people. But in the event, the transition to democracy was managed with remarkable ease. The interim government's attempt to put in place what it euphemistically described as a system of restricted democracy, fine contradiction in terms, well, that went nowhere. And in 1976, King Juan Carlos took his first important step by nominating a guy by the name of Adolfo Suárez as his prime minister. Suárez wasn't really a politician, a former bureaucrat, a civil servant of aristocratic background, someone who had served Franco loyally in the 50s and 60s. But both he and Juan Carlos agreed at this stage that the most important thing to do was to create a stable and constitutional democratic system. At the end of '76, Suárez persuaded the Francoist rubber stamp parliament to vote itself out of existence, and he announced elections for a constituent assembly that would draft a new constitution. He himself put together a centrist political party that duly won the new regime's first democratic elections in 1977. And in '78, the constitution that had been drawn up was ratified in a referendum by the Spanish people. The only threat to the process of democratization worthy of mention came 3 years later in '81, when a group of mid-ranking army officers, police officers, disgruntled with the process, broke into the Houses of Parliament, a bit like a January 6th thing here, with fewer selfie sticks, and held the members of Parliament, the deputies, hostage. They were ordered on nationwide television by King Juan Carlos in his capacity as head of the armed forces to stand down and howl down by everybody else. Even the conservative elements in Spain had no desire to return to Francoism. A second test came in '82, the following year, when Suárez's party, which had never been much more than a political vehicle for its leader, nothing much on the ideological side, when it was defeated in elections for the first time, and the socialist movement under Felipe González gained a majority. This was potentially dangerous because it might be regarded as the losers in the Spanish Civil War finally replacing the victors and perhaps being tempted to go on a revenge tour. In the event, though, no difficulties ensued. Spanish socialism, though intensely anti-clerical, it enjoyed and still enjoys poking the Catholic Church in the eye with a sharp stick. The Socialist Party in Spain was no longer Marxist, but a more or less bog standard social democratic movement of the kind that you'll see anywhere in Western Europe. The alternation in power of left and right from that point onward in successive general elections proceeded uncomplicatedly, and in 1986 the European seal of approval was given to the Spanish democratic experiment when the country was allowed to accede to membership of the European community. It is almost as happy a story in Portugal, though there the situation was somewhat more complicated, at least until the regime was eventually stabilized. While Portugal never had a civil war, it too dredged up its Franco equivalent in the form of Dr. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who came to power in 1932 after a military coup. Salazar, previously a university professor, be very afraid, like Franco at the outset had looked like fitting the template of a fascist dictator, indeed to an even greater degree than Franco himself did. Salazar claimed to head an Estado Novo, or new order, and be the new broom sweeping clean. But here again, appearances were deceiving, and Salazar's Portugal turned out to be even more conservative and backward-looking than Franco's Spain was. He too had pursued a middle course during the Second World War, also remaining neutral, providing some base facilities to the Allies, while quietly selling tungsten and other essential raw materials to the Axis. In spite of this, after the war ended, Portugal had become one of the founder members of NATO and the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, later the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Things began to unravel, though, in the 1960s, when Salazar ill-advisedly tried single-handed to resist the global tide of decolonization and hang on to Portugal's African colonies of Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea. All three had vigorous and well-armed national independence movements, and the cost of defending Portuguese control in these places that really contributed little or nothing to the economy anyway, that cost spiraled rapidly out of control. Portugal was, and is, a lot poorer than Spain, with some tourist resorts being developed mainly in the south, the Algarve, but nothing like the petrochemical or motor vehicle industries that were springing up in Catalonia. There wasn't any surplus left over then for expensive prestige projects like overseas colonies. In 1968, Salazar suffered a closed head injury after a fall, and the Portuguese president chose a replacement for him. It is thought, incidentally, that until his death, he lived for 2 more years. Salazar continued to believe that he was prime minister. his household servants and medical advisors going along with the pretense. Either way, Portugal was in need of new leadership, and given the personalized nature of Salazar's rule, probably a new regime as well. The most powerful institution in the country, the army, increasingly came to realize that this was inevitable and that the wars in the colonies were unwinnable except at a price that few Portuguese citizens, almost none in fact, were willing to pay. In 1974, the armed forces pulled off a peaceful coup, the Carnation Revolution, which set in place a marvelously named Junta of National Salvation. This government, though, was highly unstable precisely because it was so broadly based. It included everybody from conservatives at one end of the spectrum all the way across to communists at the other, and was itself replaced by no fewer than 6 provisional governments between 74 and 76. That game of political musical chairs came to an end when the emerging moderate majority in Portugal finally got its act together to oppose what seemed to be an effort by the Portuguese Communist Party to gain exclusive control of the country. A last coup attempt by pro-communist army officers was squashed in 1975, and a new constitution put in place the following year, 76. Meanwhile, democratic political parties elsewhere in Western Europe hadn't been idle. Several social democratic movements in France, in Britain, and elsewhere helped the Portuguese socialists to get off the ground, and they groomed and trained that party's young and attractive leader, a guy called Mário Soares, as a plausible prime minister in waiting. In the first fully democratic elections, Soares became head of a centre-left coalition in which the socialists were the majority party, with the army leader who had suppressed the 75 coup taking over as president. Soares himself rose to the presidency in 86, by which time Portugal had had more than 10 democratic governments. They didn't last very long, but the alternation in power was smooth and painless. The country, like Spain, became a member of the European Community that same year. Lastly, Greece. Here the situation was a great deal more fluid than either Spain or Portugal. Last time we paid any sustained attention to Greece was back in the days of the Truman Doctrine of 1947, when an ugly and extremely vicious civil war was taking place between the communist guerrillas and the Western-backed constitutional monarchy. With help from the West, the monarchists won, but as in Spain, only at the price of leaving behind a lasting legacy of bitterness and political antagonism. Under the rule of Konstantinos Karamanlis in the 1950s, the lid had more or less been kept on the country, approximately. But in 1963, a leftist government headed by Georgios Papandreou came to power, a government supported by the Greek communists. That greatly antagonized the forces in Greek society, especially the army that had defeated the communist Elas guerrillas back in the latter half of the 1940s, and now blamed the new government for giving away their victory. Nationalists also accused the Papandreou government of doing too little to support their Hellenic brothers in Cyprus, where UN peacekeepers, as you know, had been deployed in 1964. In the end, King Constantine II dismissed Papandreou's government, though it's not entirely clear that he had the legal powers to do so. He probably didn't. And in 1967, the king called for new elections. Frightened that the left would win, that they'd be returned to power and attack the army once they were firmly in the saddle. So in other words, fearing essentially a rerun of what had happened in Spain in 1936, a group of Greek army officers, most of them with the rank of colonel, organized a military coup in April 67 and set up a junta headed by Colonel George Papadopoulos. This was a classic Latin American banana republic style coup whose authors claimed to be saving Greece from what they quaintly described as the forces of anarcho-communism. Try and wrap your head around that concept. The country's politicians were arrested, the royal palace surrounded by tanks, and the king made a puppet of the new regime with eventual disastrous consequences for his dynasty. The colonels proceeded to rule by decree. After an attempted counter-coup by King Constantine failed at the end of that same year, 67, he took it on the lam, went to Italy, and was not allowed to return to Greece until very recently, in fact, 2013. Over the following 7 years, the junta ruled brutally and inefficiently, mainly through the use of mass arrests and torture. The colonel's regime had no legitimacy overseas, nobody recognized it, and very little at home, and it was only a matter of time before it overreached itself. As you know, it finally did just that in Cyprus. In 1974, the colonels orchestrated another coup in Nicosia that produced the overthrow and exile of Archbishop Macarius III and produced the chaos that immediately followed. The result of that reckless and foolish action on Athens' part was to precipitate a Turkish invasion of the island, which the Greek army turned out to be completely incapable of resisting. Bizarrely, the colonel's regime itself publicly admitted this only 24 hours after the arrival of the Turks, destroying what little remained of its credibility. Faced with a revolt from within the armed forces themselves over where the junta was leading the country, and confronted with street demonstrations, especially one by students at the Polytechnic University in Athens, the colonels agreed to resign, to jump before they were pushed over a cliff. Karamanlis, the leader of the 1950s who had been in exile in France and was regarded across the political spectrum as the most acceptable or least unacceptable compromise candidate. He was invited back to head a provisional government of national unity. Elections shortly afterwards gave Karamanlis's own party, New Democracy, a majority. In 1980, Karamanlis, as Suarez had done in Spain, ascended to the presidency of the Greek Republic. I should say that as one of their last actions, the colonels had abolished the monarchy in 1973, and very few Greeks mourned its passing. New Democracy was voted out of office in 1981 in favour of a social democratic party, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement, or PASOK, headed at this point by Georgios Papandreou's son, Andreas. From then until 2009, when the global financial crisis hit, of which more anon, the two parties, New Democracy and PASOK, one centre-right, one centre-left, alternated in power. Greece became a member of the European community, as did the others. Now, there are definite similarities between these three cases. In each instance, the post-war previous authoritarian regimes had been completely discredited by their own rulers, with just about nobody in these respective countries wanting to see them continue. All three had relatively weak governmental institutions, making it easy to clear away the residue of the former regimes and start afresh. None had an entrenched political party willing to fight in the last ditch, or to mix my metaphors, die on the last hill to prevent regime change. There was a broad consensus on the part of the mainstream political class as to what needed to happen next. Lastly, each country benefited from the help and example of outsiders, especially the European Union. The fact that the prize of EU membership could be held out to these countries if they carried out their democratic transition properly, this was a powerful incentive for them to behave well. This indeed wouldn't be the last time that that particular carrot would be held out to troubled European countries as an incentive to them to induce them to get their respective acts together. Okay, we'll stop it there. Many thanks. Take care now.